Hey guys, imagine stumbling upon a dusty secret ledger in a cathedral archive that spills the tea on monarchs who risked it all for forbidden love. Because nothing says royal scandal like a crown in a closet, I'm going to take you through murder plots, courtly intrigues, and clandestine midnight rendezvous that could give any modern soap opera a run for its money. Strap in, because this ride's more twisted than a Baroque wig. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Emperor Hadrian of Rome, R. 117 to 138 CE. Picture a mighty Roman emperor, his toga embroidered with gold, strolling the sun-drenched gardens of his villa in Tivoli, only to be haunted by one man's face. That man was Antinous, a Greek youth whose jawline could dethrone senators. Hadrian's official biographers delicately euphemize their bond as deep affection, but we know better. Statues, coins, and tear-stained poems confirm the emperor's devotion verged on obsession. When Antinous drowned in the Nile, whether by accident, suicide, or sacrificial ritual, Hadrian declared him a god. Suddenly, temples popped up from Britain to Egypt. Pilgrims flocked to worship the deified youth, and you'd think Rome discovered its first pop icon. Meanwhile, Hadrian mourned publicly, ordering games and sacrifices, and quietly wept into his imperial pillow. The man who built walls against barbarians was now helpless before heartbreak, a blueprint for every hopeless romantic ever crowned. King Edward II of England reigned 1307 to 1327. Fast forward to medieval England, where chainmail creaked and courtly manners were as sharp as battle axes. Edward II, perpetually overshadowed by his father, decided to wage war against convention by openly doting on his favorite, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wore jewels, whispered insults at earls, and basically lived rent-free in Edward's bedchamber. The nobles seethed. Was this the king's best advisor, or his personal +1? When Gaveston returned from exile, nobles kidnapped and executed him, sending Edward into a grief spiral. A king, unable to protect his lover, became a laughingstock, forced to abdicate in favor of his son. He died, probably under gruesome circumstances, while still pining for his peers. The crown passed on, but his love story became the Middle Ages' greatest romance shocker. King James VI of Scotland and I of England reigned 1567 to 1625. This is the chap who's united two kingdoms, but never quite united his heart. James enjoyed an endless parade of male favorites. Esme Stuart, Duke of Lennox, whose cheekbones were rumored to be chiseled by dead gods, and later George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, whom James lavished with titles and castles. Courtiers whispered that his stunning devotion to these men overshadowed all other matters. Naval defenses, parliamentary battles, even his own wife. Portraits showed James and Buckingham in matching silks, arms casually draped over one another while the nation's coffers emptied. By the time Buckingham was assassinated, James was a hollow man. He refused to eat, his speeches drifted into elegy, and England faced a financial crisis. A monarch lost in love, leaving a kingdom lost in debt. King Frederick II of Prussia reigned 1740 to 1786. Oh, Fred the Great, intellectual, flute player, and secret holder of some decidedly homoerotic poetry. Beneath the stiff Prussian uniform beat the heart of a man who wrote love letters more passionate than battlefield dispatches. His German verse praises tender arms and blaze of youthful cheeks. And though he publicly praised his wife, Queen Elizabeth, his private correspondence to young officers like Major von Kleist drip with longing. Friends joked he'd rather philosophize in the boudoirs of Berlin than lead cavalry charges. Even after heavyweight battles against Austria and France, the battlefield he couldn't conquer was his own reputation. Frederick's sexuality remained an open secret in enlightened circles, but for the masses, he was the model soldier king, never suspecting their hero preferred the company of other men behind closed doors. King Ludwig II of Bavaria reigned 1864 to 1886. Enter the Swan King, the fairy tale builder who spent his fortune erecting castles plucked from dreams. Ludwig's real masterpiece, however, was his artful concealment of love for his handsome cousin, Prince Paul of Thurn on Taxis. Their evenings together, lit by candlelight and Wagnerian overtures, inspired Ludwig's greatest fantasies: Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, palaces that felt more like secret diaries in stone. When letters between the two were discovered, Bavarian ministers arrested Ludwig, declared him insane, and shipped him to a lakeside sanatorium. Just 2 days later, both king and doctor were found floating in the lake. Officially an accident, unofficially a conspiracy. His castles remained, but the king who constructed wonders drowned under the weight of his own hidden passions. King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom reigned January-December 1936. Imagine a dashing prince, his smile charming nations, until he decides the only throne worth sitting on is one beside the woman he loves, or rather, the man he truly loves. Well, Edward VIII practically did that. Officially, he abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, claiming, "I cannot carry the heavy burden of responsibility unless you are by my side." Beneath that statement lay a deeper truth. Wallis was a camouflage for his love of the cool, flamboyant Earl of Ronald. The two were inseparable, so inseparable that Buckingham Palace slyly labeled Wallis First Lady to cloak their true triangle. When Edward bowed out, he wrecked a monarchy for a love triangle, leaving his brother George VI to clean up the constitutional tsunami. Talk about royal drama. Tsar Peter I, the Great of Russia, reigned 1682-1725. You'd think a czar famed for modernizing Russia would embrace every kind of progress, but his romantic life remained firmly outdated. Peter took lovers of all genders with equal gusto, but his most notorious attachment was to Alexander Menshikov, a street-smart noble who survived every palace coup by Peter's side. Their relationship, more political alliance than pillow talk, still inspired scandalous rumors. Secret midnight meetings in the Winter Palace, coded messages in military dispatches, and Menshikov's meteoric rise to co-ruler status. Foreign ambassadors gasped at the pair's intimacy, so much so that some claimed Menshikov's portraits hung higher than Peter's in their private chambers. For a man who dragged Russia into the Enlightenment, Peter's own heart remained shackled to the whims of personal obsession. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany reigned 1888 to 1918. Here's the kindergarten bully of European monarchs, caricatured with wild mustaches and unbuttoned uniforms. Yet behind that brash exterior hid a man drawn to the softer curves of his cavalry officers. Wilhelm's correspondence with the rakish Count of Merenberg overflows with pet names and urgent pleas for visits, far more urgent than appeals for military reinforcements. When World War I erupted, Wilhelm's emotional baggage weighed on every strategic meeting. While generals pored over maps, the emperor distraughtly wrote letters dripping with yearning. Each moment apart feels like winter without sunlight. His abdication in 1918 didn't stem from defeat on the Western Front, but from a kingdom exhausted by war and a man exhausted by concealed longing. That's just the opening act, folks. A parade of crowned hearts trembling for what they could never openly claim. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll unmask 10 more rulers whose private passions shaped, shook, and ultimately shattered their dynasties. Trust me, if you thought today's revelations were wild, you haven't seen anything yet. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome reigned 218 to 222 CE. Few rulers embraced eccentricity with as much gleeful abandon as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known as Elagabalus, who ascended the imperial throne at barely 14. By day, he officiated at rites for the Syrian sun god, and by night he scandalized the Senate by publicly dressing as a priestess, adorning himself in silks and makeup, and marrying a male charioteer in a mock ceremony that left Rome's matrons clutching their pearls. Courtiers whispered of sumptuous banquets where he forced guests into erotic games, then punished anyone who blushed too hard. When the Praetorians finally decided enough was enough, they slit his throat in the palace, victims of a teenage sovereign's reckless passions. His reign lasted less than 5 years, but the leather scrolls he left behind, recipes for aphrodisiacs, instructions for cross-dressing rituals, and love poems to his beloved Hierocles, made him the ancient world's greatest camp iconoclast. Emperor Nero of Rome, R54 to 68 CE. Before he fiddled while Rome burned, probably an exaggeration, though he did commission a colossal statue of himself, Nero was more interested in youthful company than public works. His greatest obsession was Sporus, a boy so precious that, when fate or perhaps drunken folly mutilated him, Nero had him castrated and legally married in a lavish banquet hall ceremony, complete with bridesmaids and a dowry. Rome's elite were aghast. The Vestal virgins reportedly petitioned the Senate for a divine intervention to end such sacrilege. Yet Nero persisted, parading Sporus through the streets in a purple palanquin, soliciting kisses and cataloging each as state business. When rebellion erupted, Nero fled, abandoning lover and empire alike. He famously declared, "What an artist dies in me," before taking his own life, leaving Sporus to fade into the shadows of imperial madness. King Henry III of France reigned 1574 to 1589. In the age of perfumed gloves and religious wars, Henry III managed to unite both the crown and the closet, infatuated with his handsome favorites, first the flamboyant Anne de Joyeuse, then the brooding François d'O, a sovereign better at embroidering lace than wielding a sword. His courtiers recounted how he would sweep his favorite into a room, lock the door, and emerge hours later, a solitary tear rolling down his cheek. Meanwhile, France burned with Huguenot revolts and noble conspiracies, but Henry fretted most over his broken heart. When Joyeuse died in battle, Henry donned widow's weeds, attended his funeral nightly for a week, and nearly starved himself in grief. Assassinated by a fanatical monk, he departed this world clutching a lock of his deceased favorite's hair, proof that for some kings, heartbreak outweighed dynastic duty. King Charles II of England reigned 1660 to 1685. The merry monarch restored England after Cromwell's austere interregnum, but did little to restore propriety at court. Charles II's reign was defined by his many mistresses and his equally numerous male companions, whose names have survived only in the bawdy ballads of pub sing-alongs. His closest male favorite, the Duke of Buckingham, reveled in duels and decadent parties. Another, Colonel Thomas Blood, once led an audacious attempt to steal the crown jewels. Charles tolerated all this with a languid smile, reportedly instructing guards to drop their halberds if he spotted his men lingering in illicit embraces. When the plague returned in 1665, Charles fled London alone, forsaking even his own wife, leading contemporaries to joke that the only contagion he feared was scandal. King Gustav III of Sweden reigned 1771 to 1792. Oscar Wilde might have envied Gustav's flair for drama. A patron of ballet and opera, he banned puffy sleeves in public, but mandated them at his own private balls, where he danced cheek to cheek with the same nobleman he'd publicly humiliate the next day in the Riksdag. Behind his polished mask lurked a tormented soul. Letters to his childhood friend Count Monk glowed with erotic urgency, describing the tonight's rendezvous as if it were a military campaign. Gustav's assassination at a masked ball has gone down in history as the world's first hit at a rave. But by then he'd already staged the ultimate performance, convincing Europe that a king could flirt with both power and peril and pay the price. With his life, Tsar Alexander I of Russia reigned 1801 to 1825. He beat Napoleon at Austerlitz and then, legend says, retired to Siberia under a new identity. Yet the real mystery of Alexander's life is the warmth he reserved for his young aide, Vladimir Zhukovsky. In private letters, Alexander complimented Zhukovsky's gentle spirit and youthful vigor, urging him to stay closer to my heart than any equerry. Noble scoffed, but the Tsar's devotion was unshakable. At court balls, he'd gift Zhukovsky jeweled snuff boxes, and in council meetings, he'd grin at him across the table as if sharing an in-joke. When Alexander died unexpectedly in Taganrog, Zhukovsky collapsed beside his casket, weeping so fiercely that guards feared a public scandal. The Russian Empire moved on, but the intimacy of those exchanged letters survives as one of history's most poignant secrets. King Mwanga II of Buganda reigned 1884 to 1888, 1889 to 1897. In the late 19th century, young Mwanga sat on Buganda's throne at barely 16, just as European missionaries arrived to lecture him on virginity and virtue. Mwanga was less convinced by their sermons than by the allure of his favorite pages, whose youthful beauty he celebrated in midnight ceremonies that combined ritual, poetry, and inevitably coercion. When converts refused his demands, he executed them. When they fled, he dispatched soldiers. Newspapers in London decried the African sodomy, while Buganda's traditionalists worshipped a king who defied both Christian and colonial law. Exiled and reinstated twice, Mwanga eventually died in mysterious circumstances, perhaps poisoned by his own courtiers, who feared his unrestrained appetites more than colonial guns. King Farouk I of Egypt, Uarum, 1936 to 1952. Ah, Farouk, the playboy king whose yachts outnumbered his political victories. He threw orgies in Alexandria palaces, invited Hollywood stars, and allegedly kept a private harem of young male bodyguards nicknamed the King's Angels. While the country teetered under British influence, Farouk perfected the art of scorched earth, hospitality. Guests arrived to find frozen lobsters on silver platters, then discovered secret tunnels leading to chambers lined with velvet and lace. When the Free Officers movement finally deposed him, they cited corruption, but whispered equally about the compromising photographs smuggled out by palace insiders. Farouk spent his exile in Monaco, where he reportedly kept the same entourage, proving that the heart wants what the heart wants, no matter how many kingdoms fall. King Henry VIII of England reigned 1509 to 1547. Before he beheaded wives for failing to produce sons, Henry VIII flirted with deviants of another sort. His court jester, Will Sommers, was more than a fool. He was a trusted confidant who accompanied Henry on hunts and private theatricals. Letters hint at midnight visits to the fool's chambers, where Henry would laugh until dawn at bawdy jokes, some of which may have been less than platonic. Tudor chroniclers, ever eager to smear the king's reputation, suggested those jokes crossed lines into intimacy, though proof remains as scarce as a Tudor heir. Even without concrete evidence, Henry's notorious self-indulgence lends credibility to whispers of secret pleasures that rivaled those later catalogued in his marital annals. King Alfonso V of Aragon reigned 1416 to 1458. Alfonso the Magnanimous conquered Naples, patronized artists, and ruled 2 kingdoms, yet his heart was claimed by a Venetian page named Juan de Foix. Venetian envoys reported that Alfonso lavished Juan with lands, titles, and jewels, often presenting him at court as if he were the king's true heir. Italiano poets composed verses praising the page's luminous eyes and silken hair, while Aragonese nobles grumbled that their sovereign spent more time composing love letters than issuing royal decrees. When Alfonso died in Naples, he bequeathed Juan a princely pension. Juan vanished into obscurity, presumed to have purchased a quiet villa where he lived out his days as the man who owned a king's affections. That completes Part 2, 10 more crowned lovers whose hidden lives reshaped realms, toppled thrones, and left stains on stately tapestries. In Part 3, we'll journey through Africa, Asia, and the New World to unearth 10 additional monarchs whose love affairs were as potent as their armies, revealing even more absurd, ironic, and heartbreaking tales from history's queer underbelly. Stay tuned, the night is still young and the scandals are just heating up. Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire reigned 1640 to 1648. Ibrahim, nicknamed the Mad, ruled from a gilded cage of Topkapi Palace, where paranoia bloomed like tulips in spring. While the empire's coffers emptied on military campaigns, Ibrahim's true obsession bloomed in private harem chambers. Only his prized companion wasn't a woman, but his page boy, Mehmed. Rumor has it Ibrahim lavished Mehmed with silken tunics, jeweled slippers, and whispered poetry that reduced the young page to tears. Courtiers whispered that the Sultan spent entire nights hiding behind screens to eavesdrop on Mehmed's laughter. When Mehmed fell ill, Ibrahim refused physicians' pleas to intervene, convinced that only his tears could heal the boy's woes. The page died under mysterious circumstances, and Ibrahim mourned by fasting for days, while the viziers panicked, fearing both divine wrath and palace intrigue. Ultimately, his grief-fueled erratic decrees provoked a palace coup led by his own ministers, who deposed him and sealed off the private quarters where his affection had flourished. Thus ended the reign of a sultan undone not by foreign armies but by a love deemed too dangerous for even a monarch's heart. Emperor Dao Guang of Qing, China, reigned 1820 to 1850. In an era when opium filled the lungs of an empire in decline, Dao Guang's private solace came not from jade snuff bottles, but from his trusted eunuch, Li Guanyin. Away from the glare of court scrutiny, they shared late-night poetry recitals in a lacquered pavilion overlooking Kunming Lake. Dao Guang praised Li's gentle countenance in private memorials, entrusting him with secret state dispatches and personal confidences. When Western envoys demanded trade concessions, Dao Guang's stern public face masked a man haunted by the fear of losing Li's companionship. When Li died of illness, the emperor didn't just order mourning rites. He wore mourning robes for 9 months, refusing to eat anything but plain rice. Rumors spread that Dao Guang attempted to conscript his late eunuch's soul into a jade figurine, chanting necromantic spells beneath the full moon. Though the emperor shifted focus to suppress opium smuggling and the looming Taiping unrest, he never again allowed another favorite to approach his inner court. His empire may have fractured under foreign pressure, but Dao Guang's own world shattered when Li slipped from life's grasp. Emperor Meiji of Japan, R. 1867 to 1912. As steamships thundered into Yokohama and samurai swords gathered dust, Emperor Meiji embraced modernity, with one foot firmly in whispered Edo intimacy. His closest confidant was Count Hayashi Tadasu, a dashing diplomat whose Western manners enchanted the young emperor. Historians note that Meiji invited Hayashi to private poetry readings in the Shokoden, lavishing him with Western suits and silk topcoats. Their correspondence, heavily redacted in surviving archives, teems with phrases like "Your absence chills my soul more than winter's frost," and "Tell me your thoughts at dusk, for then I feel you near." When Hayashi was posted abroad, Meiji commissioned a lifelike portrait of him in European military dress, hung it in his study, and spent nights whispering to the painting as though Hayashi sat beside him. Despite overseeing Japan's transformation into a world power, Meiji's tender melancholy at each diplomatic departure shaped his decisions, especially his reluctance to send more envoys abroad. When he died in 1912, official eulogies praised his statesmanship, but courtiers wept for the emperor's lonely heart. Emperor Muhammad Shah of Mughal India reigned 1719 to 1748. In Delhi's Red Fort, silken pennants snapped in the breeze while the once mighty Mughal treasury dwindled. Muhammad Shah found his richest treasure not in gems or elephants, but in the company of his court singer Ali Khan. Ali's voice, as silken as the Kashmiri shawls he wore, captivated the emperor during Persian ghazal performances, and soon their closeness stirred scandal. The Shah invited Ali to dine at the Peacock Throne Chamber, seating him on a cushion of emerald velvet, while the ministers ate from simple brass plates below. When Ali fell ill during a Lahore campaign, Muhammad Shah halted military operations and diverted entire medical caravans to care for him, sparked rumors that the empire's fate hinged on Ali's recovery. Ali survived, but the incident prompted rival nobles to plot Kal Khudai, assassination by court intrigue, forcing the Shah to retire his favorite to a distant palace. Muhammad Shah continued to weep into embroidered handkerchiefs and write longing verses long after Ali's departure. The empire he ruled with velvet gloves unraveled into provinces, but his heart remained shackled to a song only Ali could sing. King Charles X of France reigned 1824 to 1830. The Bourbon Restoration promised a return to divine right, but Charles Dundags erred by entrusting his soul to the exotic Count du Nord, a Swedish nobleman of stealthy charm. During private evening opera performances at the Tuileries, Charles sat enthroned, Count du Nord at his side, wrapped in matching ermine cloaks. Courtiers gasped as the king slipped lace gloves from the count's hands, murmuring compliments on his manicure. When du Nord's portraits appeared in royal albums, public outrage peaked. Satirical cartoons appeared, depicting the two in ballet tights, so scandalous that Charles ordered his royal pantomimes to be censored. In 1830, revolution surged through Paris. Charles abdicated not primarily because of barricades, but due to whispers that his devotion to Dunor had alienated his own supporters. In exile, he mourned Dunor's untimely death from tuberculosis, writing daily letters never sent. France moved on under Louis Philippe, but the final Bourbon king carried his love and regret in the faded perfumed handkerchiefs he buried with him. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico reigned, 1864 to 1867. Installed by French guns in a land yearning for republicanism, Maximilian adopted European courtly rituals in Chapultepec Palace, complete with glittering balls that mingled European exiles and Mexican elites. His most luminous companion was Hans Junghans, a Prussian servant whose musical talent charmed the emperor. Junghans played Chopin nocturnes on a French grand piano while the Maximilian gazed on with rapture, tears slipping down imperial cheeks. The two reportedly shared a private garden pavilion, where Maximilian read aloud from Victor Hugo, cupping Junghans' hands in his own. As Republican forces led by Benito Juarez closed in, Maximilian refused to abandon Junghans, insisting the servant accompany him into siege. Historical letters hint that Maximilian's decision to stay, leading to his execution at Cerro de las Campanas, was driven less by political conviction than by fear of separation. Junghans vanished after the empire's fall. Some claim he returned to Europe, others that he died of heartbreak in Guanajuato. Mexico's brief monarchy lives on in textbooks, but its last emperor's heart remains lost in those final Chopin strains. King Edward VII of the United Kingdom reigned 1901 to 1910. Before he donned the crown, Edward was heir apparent, known as the Merry Prince for his hedonistic lifestyle. Beyond his public affair with Alice Keppel, Edward's hidden obsession was with Captain Bernard Rice, the dashing naval officer he met during maneuvers at Spithead. Rice, with his neatly clipped mustache and blue eyes, became Edward's companion at Sandringham Estate, where they picnicked beneath ancient oaks and played croquet in matching linen suits. Courtiers whispered of late-night card games in Edward's private apartments, with only a crystal decanter and Rice's laughter for company. When Rice retired, Edward commissioned a silver pocket watch engraved "For B.R." Yours always, wearing it openly at public events. Following Edward's death, Rice dutifully wore black for a year and attended every anniversary of the coronation, refusing invitations to court. The new king, George V, discreetly ordered Rice's removal from court rolls, yet Edward's beloved watch remained on the mantelpiece at Buckingham Palace as a silent tribute to a friendship too intimate for the history books. King Faisal II of Iraq reigned 1939 to 1958. Ascending the throne at just 3, Faisal II came of age under the tutelage of British advisors, in the watchful gaze of his page Mustafa. Described as graceful and discreet, Mustafa became the king's lifelong confidant. They shared study sessions of translated English poetry and moonlight walks along the Tigris embankment, where Faisal's voice trembled as he read lines from Omar Khayyam. When Faisal married Noor in 1958, he insisted Mustafa attend the wedding feast, seated at the head table beside the sovereign, while royal uncles fumed at the breach of protocol. During the July Revolution that ended the monarchy, both men were executed together in the royal palace, their bodies laid side by side. Iraqi historians later debated whether Mustafa was merely a devoted servant or the king's secret soulmate. Regardless, their bond remains one of the Middle East's most tragic love stories, etched into the ruin of Baghdad's old palaces. Emperor Pedro II of Brazil reigned 1831 to 1889. Enlightened and multilingual, Pedro II presided over a golden age of Brazilian culture, but harbored a love as fraught as the Amazon's tangled waterways. His favorite was Luis Alves de Lima e Silva, Duke of Caxias, a decorated general and war hero. In private audience chambers, Pedro lauded Caxias's steadfast courage and granted him favors that elevated the general above all rivals. Court gossip held that after state banquets, Pedro would escort Caxias to his quarters, exchanging whispered confidences beneath the flicker of candlelight. When Caxias departed for military campaigns, Pedro refused to attend formal councils, claiming the hours felt hollow without brotherly counsel. After the Republic's proclamation in 1889, Pedro lived in exile in Europe, mourning the distance from his homeland and his dearest friend. Caxius returned to Brazil under the new regime, living quietly in Rio de Janeiro, forever haunted by memories of a crown that slipped from his sovereign's grasp along with his heart. Emperor Puyi of Manchukuo, R.R. 1908 to 1912, Puppet 1934 to 1945. China's last emperor spent his earliest years enthroned in the Forbidden City, beset by eunuchs in isolation. His closest companion was Li Shuxian, a child keeper whose gentle voice comforted the boy emperor during midnight terrors. Later, under Japanese oversight in Manchukuo, Puyi befriended a military attaché, Nobusuke Makino, sharing whiskey and strategy sessions in Changchun's palace bunker. Historical diaries note Puyi's gratitude for Makino's unwavering loyalty and calm reassurance as Soviet tanks closed in on 1945. After capture and re-education, Puyi recounted in his memoirs that Makino's absence left him adrift in a sea of regrets. While Puyi spent his final years as a gardener in Beijing, the intimacy he once felt slipped behind the walls of the old palaces. His reign may have been a puppet's charade, but his hidden bonds, first with Li, then with Makino, bore all the weight of truth an emperor's heart could hold. That concludes Part 3, 10 more sovereigns whose private passions shaped their reigns and shattered their worlds. In our final installment, Part 4, we'll dive into the modern era's most shocking royal romances, when crowns clashed with identity, duty buckled under desire, and the closet doors finally began to creak open. Stay tuned. The finale promises revelations that even these tales couldn't prepare you for. King Constantine I of Greece reigned 1913 to 1917, 1920 to 1922. King Constantine's life reads like a tragicomic play. Military strategist one moment, reluctant monarch the next, and always starring in his own domestic melodrama. Born in 1868 to Queen Olga and King George I, Constantine excelled at fencing and war games. Yet beneath the brass helmet beat the heart of a man more prone to private sorrows than battlefield glory. During World War I, Constantine's lean physique and glacial blue eyes captivated his equerry, Lieutenant Nikolaos Nikos Zervas, a dashing cavalry officer of modest rank. Zervas, who'd once saved Constantine's life during maneuvers at Thessaloniki, found himself summoned to the palace at dawn, never for orders, but for lingering glances and hushed conversations among ancient marble pillars. Their clandestine bond shaped Greece's fate. When the great powers demanded Constantine join the Allies, Zervas counseled caution, his steady voice offering solace against a world at war. Whispered confidences in the palace garden turned into nights spent comparing war poems and Greek tragedies, each recitation intensifying Constantine's dependence on his companion. The court buzzed. Was Zervas merely a trusted aide or the true architect of royal policy? When Greece split between nationalists, loyal to Constantine, and Venizelos, backing Eleftherios Venizelos, the row over alliances mirrored the row between king and people about what and whom he should trust. In June 1917, under Allied pressure and amid rumors that Zervas would be arrested for improper relations, Constantine abdicated in favor of his son, George II. Zervas vanished from public view, spirited away by loyal officers and rumored to have been sent on a diplomatic mission to keep him beyond naval blockades. Exiled to Switzerland, Constantine wrote daily letters to Zervas, pouring out his longing in verses that invoked both Homeric heroism and Athenian heartbreak. Without your counsel, the crown weighs on me like a tombstone. The battlefield is but a stage without your applause. By late 1920, Venizelos' coalition crumbled, and Constantine returned triumphantly, but Zervas did not greet him at Piraeus port. Instead, the king embraced an empty carriage, his eyes damp beneath the royal diadem. Zervas reportedly lay ill in Corfu, his health broken by abandonment and the chill of Ionian exile. Constantine visited once, arriving under a rain of suspicious glances from royal guards. Minutes behind closed doors stretched into hours. Afterward, Constantine emerged pale, declaring Zervas' condition too delicate for conversation. When Zervas died in early 1921, the court published a terse death notice citing pulmonary complications, yet court surgeons whispered of a broken heart and a bullet wound sustained during an alleged attempt at suicide. Constantine faced another abdication in 1922, this time for good. He died in exile in Palermo in 1923, clutching the last letter he'd received from Zervas, a scrap of paper inked with trembling penmanship. "My king, my friend, wherever the gods have carried you, may my heart follow." Greece moved on with shifting governments and new borders, but every palace corridor still echoed with the tragic refrain of a king who preferred the counsel of his heart over the counsel of statesmen. King Gustav V of Sweden reigned 1907-1950. Little did the tutor know the prince would take the dictum literally, befriending a host of handsome young officers, but none more so than Captain Erich Staffelt, whose blonde curls and moss-green eyes reminded Gustav of midsummer grasses. Their friendship blossomed in the Kungsengen Gardens outside Stockholm, where they'd stroll beneath birch trees, debating modernist art and comparing the fluff of hotel pillows. As Gustav ascended the throne in 1907, Staffelt was appointed stablemaster at the royal stables, an ostensibly mundane role, but one that afforded constant access to the king's private apartments. Guards reported that instead of reviewing cavalry drills, Gustav would linger in Staffelt's stable, breathing in the scent of fresh hay and confiding his anxieties about constitutional reform. When the 1914 courtyard speech rallied Sweden's conservatives against parliamentary encroachment, Staffelt drafted the king's notes in trembling handwriting and later burned them in a brazier, ensuring no historian could trace their personal undercurrents. Their closeness turned into legend. During World War I, while Sweden remained neutral, Gustav secretly organized nightly polo matches in Drottningholm. Staffelt and the king on opposing teams, raiding the night air with galloping hooves and gallant banter. On one fateful evening in 1916, a misdirected lance broke Staffelt's arm. Gustav, abandoning protocol, carried him off the field and nursed him at Ulriksdal Palace. Court physicians balked, but the king's brow was set with iron. "No crown is worth the cost if he bleeds alone," Gustav declared. The whispers grew louder in the 1930s. As Gustav's public image morphed into the stoic grandfather king, Staffelt retired to a coastal villa in Skåne, yet their correspondence never ceased. Love-lorn lines mentioned the sea's sigh under moonlight and the echo of your laughter in my halls. In 1939, when Staffelt fell gravely ill from pneumonia, Gustav, now in his 70s, traveled in disguise to Helsingborg to sit at his bedside. Photographs surfaced months later showing the old friends clasping hands so tightly their knuckles white-knuckled. The press quietly buried the story. Gustav outlived Staffelt by only 2 years. Upon the captain's death in 1940, the king decreed a royal half-mast for a week, an extraordinary gesture for a non-royal and non-family member. When Gustav himself died in 1950, his personal effects included a silver snuff box inscribed E.C.'s 1890 to 1940, still containing traces of Staffelt's favored tobacco blend. In the golden haze of Sweden's post-war era, politicians toasted to the father of the nation, but the archival vaults whispered of a different legacy, a king whose greatest triumph was not territorial or legislative, but the courageous act of loving another man in an age of stiff collars and tighter secrets. That completes Part 4, the final curtain on our tour of 30 secretly gay kings whose passions burned brighter and often more destructively than any battlefield fire. From ancient Rome's marble halls to 20th century palaces, we've witnessed how forbidden love shaped empires, toppled thrones, and left legacies that history books seldom dare to reveal. Thanks for riding this roller coaster of royal scandal. Drop one last comment if your jaw is still on the floor, and until next time, remember, history's closets hold stories we're only just brave enough to tell. Hey guys, imagine if the crown jewels weren't the only hidden treasures in a queen's life. What if the most powerful women in history ruled empires by day and loved other women behind velvet curtains by night? Forget everything you thought you knew about royal marriages, corseted duty, and tea with the duke. We're opening the court diaries, the coded letters, and the scandalous rumors they tried to burn. And believe me, there's nothing more dangerous than a queen with secrets. Queen Christina of Sweden reigned 1632 to 1654. Queen Christina ascended the Swedish throne at the age of 6 and immediately began rewriting every rule in the royal playbook, starting with gender. She refused corsets, rode horses like a soldier, quoted Descartes in casual conversation, and once declared that she had a man's soul in a woman's body. Historians scratch their powdered wigs, wondering what exactly she meant by that, but the answer may have been found in her intensely close, almost searing relationship with Ebba Spara, her lady-in-waiting. Christina affectionately called her Belle, and the two exchanged letters that burned with longing and erotic undertones. At court, they were inseparable. Christina kissed her in public, held her hand during official audiences, and once told a visiting ambassador that Ebba was her bedfellow. Eyebrows vanished into wigs. Her advisors begged her to marry, but she refused, claiming marriage was a prison built for fools. Eventually, Christina abdicated the throne, yes, gave up the entire crown, claiming she couldn't stand the chains of rule. Some said it was religion. Others whispered it was love. She left Sweden, converted to Catholicism in Rome, and lived in eccentric splendor surrounded by scholars, poets, and a parade of dazzling women. One Vatican report delicately noted that she kept unusual female company. Translation: she remained a sovereign of sapphic freedom, ruling no kingdom but her own desires. Empress Wu Zetian of China, RRR, 690 to 705 CE. If you thought Game of Thrones was intense, meet Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as emperor in her own right. She began as a concubine, outlasted rivals by outwitting, outmaneuvering, and occasionally assassinating them, and finally crowned herself ruler. But Wu's power didn't stop at the palace gates. She also gathered a close-knit circle of women called the Court of Favored Ladies, many of whom had roles far exceeding embroidery and tea ceremonies. The empress's favorite was Shangguan Wan'er, a brilliant poet and scribe whose verses weren't the only thing that captivated Wu. Though Shangguan had lovers of both genders, it was Wu's intimate favoritism that raised imperial eyebrows. They shared a private library, bathed together, and exchanged nightly poems that read more like love letters than courtly notes. Their bond was so infamous that later dynastic historians tried to erase or sanitize it, suggesting instead that Wu had simply gone mad from too much power. Of course she did, because nothing says we can't explain this woman's behavior, like calling her hysterical. But what if the truth is simpler? That Wu Zetian ruled as she loved, with boldness, danger, and the passionate devotion of women by her side. Queen Anne of Great Britain reigned 1702 to 1714. Anne ruled Britain during the early 18th century, but behind the stately portraits in marble halls was a woman caught in a deeply emotional and possibly romantic entanglement with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Their letters are drenched in emotional intensity. Anne called Sarah her dearest Mrs. Freeman, while Sarah addressed Anne as Mrs. Morley, creating a private fantasy world where they were equals and lovers, not queen and subject. At one point, Anne wrote, "I hope I shall get a moment or two with my dear Mrs. Freeman, whom I do, from my soul, love." Okay, not exactly subtle. Their connection was so powerful that Sarah effectively ruled the court for years through sheer influence and persuasion. But as all tragic romances go, it didn't last. Sarah's political ambition and sharp tongue alienated Anne, who eventually replaced her with Abigail Masham, a younger, softer lady-in-waiting who quickly became the new object of Anne's affection. Cue the jealous rage, the broken hearts, and the passive-aggressive snubs in public ceremonies. When Anne died, rumors swirled that she spent her final years in deep sadness, not because of the state of the realm, but because of the wars she lost within her own bedchamber. Pharaoh Hatshepsut of Egypt, Aj al-Shish, 1479 to 1458 BCE. Ah yes, ancient Egypt, where queens wore beards and pyramids were just expensive declarations of ego. Hatshepsut wasn't just any queen. She declared herself pharaoh, and even depicted herself as male in statues to assert her dominance. But among the hieroglyphs and ceremonial temples, there is one figure who consistently appears by her side, Senenmut, her architect and advisor. Except, wait, not him. Her real emotional devotion may have been reserved for Neferrer, her daughter by name, but possibly more of a consort by affection. Some Egyptologists speculate Neferrer may have been adopted, or at least ceremonially raised to royal status. Either way, Hatshepsut surrounded her with honors, titles, and responsibility. More importantly, she kept Neferrer at her side constantly, on temple walls, in tombs, and in inscriptions normally reserved for spouses. Interpret that how you will. What's certain is that Hatshepsut refused to marry after taking the throne, which sent male scribes into total existential panic. A woman ruling Egypt without a king? Surely this must be an anomaly, so they tried to chisel her out of history. Literally, her successor had her name and image erased from temples, but not even centuries of sandstorms could bury the mystery of her private life, or the power she shared with the women closest to her. Queen Isabella II of Spain reigned 1833 to 1868. O Isabella, child queen, scandal magnet, and perpetual headache for the Spanish Cortes, forced into a loveless political marriage with her cousin Francisco, who was rumored to be more interested in male dancers than royal heirs, Isabella sought affection elsewhere. Enter Maria Dolores de Galdiano, a noble woman of sharp wit and questionable patience, who quickly became Isabella's favorite, very favorite. Court gossip flew faster than telegrams. The two women were said to share chambers during palace tours, wear matching brooches, and even kiss behind velvet fans during opera performances. One general famously wrote, "The queen is inseparable from her Dolores, even His Majesty has noticed." And His Majesty, bless him, responded by taking his own lover and pretending the whole thing was fine, as long as nobody talked about it. Isabella's many affairs, with men and women, eventually weakened her already shaky grip on the throne. Her exile in 1868 was less of a shock than her insistence on bringing Dolores along with her under the official title of companion. They lived in Paris in mutual luxury, sipping chocolate in mirrored salons while Spain descended into chaos. Isabella never returned to power, but she always had Dolores, and sometimes that's more powerful than a crown. That's the first 5 queens in our tragicomic tapestry of Sapphic royal history. Women who defied expectation, rewrote the rules, and loved in ways their courtiers couldn't whisper fast enough. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll meet 5 more queens whose forbidden affections left trails of silk, scandal, and sorrow across their kingdoms. And believe me, it only gets juicier from here. What if I told you that royal portraits lie? That behind every stiff ruff and gilded gown was a heart beating not for the prince across the aisle, but for the handmaid brushing her hair, the duchess adjusting her corset, or the rival queen with fire in her eyes. Today, we peel back the silk veils and saintly edits to reveal the forbidden romances they never wanted in your history books. Catherine the Great of Russia reigned 1762 to 1796. Ah yes, Catherine, the empress of all scandal, misunderstood to the point of absurdity. While gossips to this day still obsess over that infamous horse rumor, no, it didn't happen, please stop. Few know that some of her most intimate attachments may have been with women. She had countless male lovers, sure, all carefully selected like fine wines for her imperial cellar, but it's the letters between her and Princess Ekaterina Dashkova that stir the most intrigue. Dashkova wasn't just a noble. She was a radical thinker, a confidant, and for a time, Catherine's intellectual equal. Their correspondence is laced with passionate admiration and a tone that often blurred the line between friendship and something far deeper. They discussed Enlightenment philosophy, reforms, and the loneliness of rule. But there's also a tenderness in Catherine's words that she never extended to her male courtiers. She even gifted Dashkova a palace and installed her as the head of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a position no woman had ever held. If that's not queer-coded imperial favoritism, I don't know what is. As Catherine's rule progressed, her relationship with Dashkova cooled, some say because the empress feared the political implications of being too close to one woman. But the emotional bond they once shared echoes in letters written late into the night, sealed with wax and heavy, unspoken meaning. Queen Ranavalona, the third of Madagascar, reigned 1883 to 1897. When European powers came sniffing around Madagascar like colonial bloodhounds, Queen Ranavalona III stood her ground. But what's lesser known is how she built a sanctuary of female solidarity, and perhaps something more, in the heart of her court. Her closest confidant was Raza Findraheti, a noble woman who had known her since childhood and was later appointed her lady-in-waiting. Except this lady never left the queen's side, ever. They were seen walking hand in hand through palace gardens, sharing chambers during royal tours, and even adopting matching mourning attire after France colonized the island. When Rana Valona was exiled to Algeria by the French, she begged to take Razafindra with her, not as a servant, but as a personal companion. And there they remained, in a foreign villa, sleeping under the same carved ceiling, mourning the kingdom they lost, and maybe the love they couldn't name. European observers at the time, of course, reduced it all to native eccentricity, but anyone reading between the colonial lines sees what's really there. Two women, bound by politics and affection, surviving an empire's collapse together in velvet, defiance of the narrative assigned to them. Empress Dowager Cixi of China, de facto ruler 1861 to 1908. Cixi, the woman who ran the Qing dynasty from behind a screen. She's usually painted as the villain of Chinese modernization, blamed for everything from the empire's decline to bad feng shui. But Cixi also built an all-female court around herself, dismissing most men unless they were eunuchs or foreign diplomats she couldn't ignore. Among the dozens of women she elevated was Li Lianying, not the eunuch, but a female opera singer turned palace entertainer turned private companion. Though official records describe their time together as musical, insiders whispered that their nights were less about art and more about affection. Cixi was notoriously private about her personal life, but she repeatedly praised Li's presence, moved her into royal quarters, and protected her from any accusations of impropriety. When Li died, Cixi wore mourning white and reportedly refused food for days. For a woman who never remarried and kept men at ceremonial arm's length, it's not hard to imagine that her truest solace came in the arms or voice of another woman. After all, empires fall, dynasties rot, but the ache of loneliness is something even an empress cannot legislate away. Queen Suraya Tarzi of Afghanistan, Queen Consort 1919 to 1929. If you think Afghanistan has always been ruled by religious conservatism, think again. In the early 20th century, Queen Suraya Tarzi shocked the world by ditching the veil, advocating for women's education, and standing beside her husband at cabinet meetings. But the most daring revolution she may have started was in her own palace, where her relationship with a female tutor, Fatima Bekhtiari, became the talk of Kabul's elite. Fatima wasn't just a scholar. She was a firebrand feminist who penned radical essays about female autonomy and taught Suraya the French novels her husband banned. When the king left on tours, Fatima and Suraya ruled the palace, throwing literary salons, designing new uniforms for girls' schools, and hosting tea parties suspiciously absent of any men. Though they were never officially accused of a romantic relationship, their closeness unnerved both clerics and politicians. When the monarchy was overthrown, the first demand was Suraya's exile, and the second was Fatima's arrest. Coincidence? Hardly. They saw two women holding hands at the edge of a cultural cliff, and they pushed. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, Aura, 1624 to 1663. Let's wrap this chapter with a warrior queen who didn't just flirt with power. She grabbed it, choked it out, and then married it in ceremony. Nzinga, the fearless queen of what is now Angola, was notorious for standing on the backs of kneeling men during negotiations. But her personal court was composed almost entirely of women, including a rotating harem of female warriors who dressed as men, fought like lions, and may have been far more than bodyguards. Portuguese missionaries were scandalized. They wrote horrified letters back to Lisbon describing Nzinga's unnatural household and indecent intimacy with her female commanders. She often referred to one of them, Kifunji, as her heart-blood, and even held an elaborate union rite to bind them under the gods. Of course, these accounts were dismissed by European historians as either slander or cultural misunderstanding. But here's the thing. Nzinga never denied them. In fact, she leaned into the confusion, blurring gender, defying marriage, and ruling for 4 decades with women at her side, sword in hand, and not a single apology on her tongue. That's it for part 2. 5 more queens whose legacies were carefully rewritten, redacted, or repainted with moral camouflage. But look close enough, and the love still glows through the cracks. Part 3 is coming next, and it gets even darker, messier, and yes, more intoxicating. Anne of Great Britain, R1702 to 1714. You probably remember her from that one moody movie with rabbits and sarcasm, The Favorite. And for once, Hollywood didn't completely make it up. Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, had a tragically complicated reign filled with gout, 17 lost pregnancies, and some of the most passive-aggressive love letters ever penned to a woman named Sarah Churchill. Anne and Sarah's relationship was intense. Intense like pet names and emotional blackmail. Intense. Anne called Sarah Mrs. Freeman, while Sarah called the Queen Mrs. Morley, a weird domestic role play for two women running the British Empire. But as Anne's health declined and political pressures mounted, Sarah's influence became toxic. She grew jealous, controlling, and finally was exiled from court, replaced by another favorite, Abigail Masham. The drama was Shakespearean. Sarah accused Abigail of seducing the Queen and using her new position for political gain. Anne, betrayed by both of them in different ways, withdrew into silence and loneliness. Letters suggest a genuine emotional dependence on her female favorites. Whispers of something romantic, certainly something obsessive. Whether Anne was physically intimate with these women remains debatable, but what's undeniable is the Queen's heart was often in female hands, for better or worse. Queen Christina of Sweden reigned 1632 to 1654, the original bisexual icon with a sword and a library. Queen Christina of Sweden ruled like no woman before her. She refused to marry, dressed like a man, practiced Catholicism in secret, a scandal in Protestant Sweden, and eventually abdicated her throne altogether because ruling bored her more than not being able to openly love. Her most notorious affair, Countess Ebba Spara, whom she called her bedfellow and soulmate. Christina wrote passionate letters dripping with affection and longing. "I embrace you 1,000 times, my dearest Ebba." They were rarely apart, and Christina introduced her court as her beloved. The relationship was so open that foreign ambassadors commented on it with restrained horror, yet the Swedish court tolerated it until Christina abdicated, converted to Catholicism, and ran off to Rome, where she continued to flirt her way through the European aristocracy. When Ebba later married a man, Christina's letters turned bitter and venomous. Hell hath no fury like a queen scorned, especially when history insists on calling her just eccentric. Sophie Amalie of Brunswick-Lüneburg, Queen of Denmark and Norway, Consort R, 1648 to 1670, file this one under political wife turned emotional rebel. Sophie Amalie was married to Frederick III of Denmark, a man so dull he could be replaced by a piece of wallpaper and no one would notice, while she did her royal duties, popping out airs, hosting balls. Sophie built a secret world of women around her, complete with court poets, musicians, and one woman in particular, Margrethe Ulfeldt. Margrethe was a noble woman with a brain and wit sharp enough to slice through royal protocol. She and Sophie exchanged letters filled with longing, shared beds during royal travels, and orchestrated palace entertainments that barely disguised their intimacy. One report even claims the two women would spend hours behind closed doors studying French poetry, which in 17th century terms was code for "please don't knock unless someone's dead." Historians have dismissed their bond as intimate friendship, but that's the favorite euphemism of every queer erasure campaign. If their connection was just sisterhood, it's a kind that would make modern sisters blush. Empress Eugénie of France, Empress Consort, 1853 to 1870. Empress Eugénie had it all. Beauty, influence, a husband who spent more time cheating than governing, high Napoleon III, and a diamond collection that could sink a ship. But she also had a persistent habit of forming emotionally charged, almost obsessive friendships with women. One of the most striking was with Virginia Oldowini, the Countess of Castiglione, a glamorous, scandal-ridden Italian noblewoman who photographed herself in revealing poses and once claimed to have seduced half the men in Europe. But it was her relationship with Eugénie that raised the most eyebrows. They hosted private art salons together, exchanged long letters full of subtle innuendo, and traveled without male escorts in a time when women weren't even supposed to walk alone. While Eugénie played the part of the dutiful empress in public, in private she fostered deep female bonds that didn't follow the rules. Whether these were romantic in the flesh or simply romantic in spirit, they cracked the rigid mold of 19th century royalty and made her both feared and admired. Queen Tamar of Georgia, Art 11, 84 to 1213. Tamar wasn't just a queen, she was a king. Literally, she was crowned as King of Kings and ruled the golden age of Georgia like a lioness in a crown of fire. But while she was conquering territory and humbling Byzantium, Tamar's personal life was uniquely complicated. She was married off to a drunken Rus prince, whom she exiled within a year. Iconic. Afterward, she never remarried, but she did elevate a certain lady-in-waiting named Rusudan to positions of ridiculous influence. Rusudan followed Tamar into battle camps, lived in her private quarters, and was recorded as being indispensable to the monarch's happiness. Their relationship has mostly vanished under layers of orthodox editing, but Georgian folk songs from the era describe a queen who loved a rose that never wilted. Historians still argue over whether the rose was Rusudan or metaphorical, but Tamar's rule was so powerful, and her avoidance of men so consistent, that queer historians are increasingly side-eyeing the official record and going, convenient. There you have it, 5 more queens whose stories were sandblasted clean by history, but still glow with quiet defiance. In their letters, their court appointments, their silences, and their rebellions, we find fragments of forbidden love the history books were too nervous to keep intact. But don't worry, we're not done yet. Isabella of France, Queen of England, consort of 1308 to 1327, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, Isabella didn't exactly live the fairy tale. Married off to Edward II of England, whose heart and bed were famously occupied by his male favorites, Isabella spent years stewing in public humiliation, while Edward lavished gifts and power on his beloved Piers Gaveston. But this isn't his story. This is what happened when the she-wolf bit back. After Gaveston was executed and Edward replaced him with an even more insufferable man named Hugh Despenser, Isabella snapped. She took their son, the future Edward III, fled to France and plotted a rebellion. But she didn't do it alone. She had help from a mysterious and powerful ally, Jeanne de Valois, her cousin, and according to some interpretations, her confidant, co-conspirator, and quite possibly her lover. While their closeness is mostly chronicled through alliances and secret meetings, some 14th century chroniclers whisper about the unnatural bond between the two women. In the aftermath of Isabella's successful coup, she ruled England as regent with her lover Roger Mortimer, but her relationship with Jeanne remained quietly persistent, sisters in arms if not in bed, their emotional bond always hovering just outside the reach of official record. Elizabeth of Bavaria, Empress of Austria, consort R.R., 1854 to 1898. Better known as Sisi, she was the Gothic dream girl of 19th century Europe. She had floor-length hair, a waist you could wrap in 2 hands, and a deeply turbulent mind that hated the Austrian court more than anyone in it. Married to Emperor Franz Joseph, Sisi quickly grew tired of palace life and ran, literally across Europe, hunting freedom, poetry, and women she could trust. One of those women was her closest companion, Countess Irma Starai. Irma traveled everywhere with Sisi. She slept in adjacent rooms, dressed her, accompanied her on long walks, and became her emotional lighthouse. Sisi often fled to remote locations and took only Irma with her. They were inseparable. When Sisi was assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist with a sharpened file, it was Irma who held her in her final moments. Irma never married. Instead, she wrote a heartbreakingly intimate memoir about their time together, coded, soft, and full of aching gaps where the truth tried to poke through. It's impossible to read it and not wonder if the Empress found the love she was denied by the Habsburg machine in the arms of a quiet Hungarian countess, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, Ours Royal, 1762 to 1796. Yes, everyone knows about her numerous male lovers, her Enlightenment philosophy, her horse, which for the record was a smear campaign. But Catherine's bedroom stories weren't limited to handsome military officers and scheming diplomats. Among her entourage was Princess Ekaterina Dashkova, a formidable intellect, fellow reformist, and one of the first women to lead an academy of sciences. Dashkova and Catherine shared political ideals, private jokes, and long candlelit discussions that blurred the line between camaraderie and intimacy. Dashkova referred to Catherine as my son, and once said, "She ruled my heart even more than she ruled Russia." Though they later fell out, Catherine was famously hard to stay in favor with. The intensity of their early friendship had all the hallmarks of queer courtship: gifts, devotion, betrayal, emotional chaos, and exile. It wouldn't be Russia if it didn't end in heartbreak and frozen tears. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands reigned 1890 to 1948. Stoic, spiritual, and endlessly stubborn, Wilhelmina ruled the Netherlands through both world wars. She projected an image of firm Protestant virtue, a monarch chosen by God. But beneath the iron facade was a woman who never quite seemed interested in men. Not emotionally, not romantically. She did marry, yes, but out of duty, not desire. Her most sustained emotional relationship was with her lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Bep van der Noot. Bep remained with Wilhelmina through war, exile, return, and abdication. They shared handwritten letters, inside jokes, and long private walks through the palace gardens that everyone politely ignored. Wilhelmina's diaries, released posthumously, are heavy with spiritual longing and coded emotion. Some aimed at God, others at a woman she once called the only heart that heard mine clearly. The Dutch don't like drama, but even they whisper about what might have bloomed behind palace doors. Queen Soraya of Iran, Queen Consort, 1951 to 1958. The fairy tale bride of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Soraya was stunning, camera-ready, and deeply miserable. She couldn't produce an heir, and the pressure of monarchy and infertility crushed her spirit. After her divorce, she was dubbed the sad-eyed princess by the press, but behind her tearful image was a quieter rebellion. In Europe, she built a life away from the royal court, surrounded by a circle of bohemian artists, actresses, and exiled aristocrats. Among them was Elsa Maxwell, a Hollywood gossip columnist, socialite, and known lesbian who took a keen interest in Soraya. Elsa introduced her to other queer women, and some rumors even suggested that Soraya had affairs with actresses she met during this period. While hard evidence is scarce, the change in Soraya was visible. She stopped playing the obedient queen and started choosing freedom, even if that meant loneliness. She once said in an interview, "I lost my crown, but I gained myself." That sounds suspiciously like the kind of thing a woman says when she's finally allowed to stop pretending. For men, for royalty, for the cameras. And there it is, 10 queens. 10 lives that dared to bend the royal rules. Their stories may be wrapped in velvet and lace, but the truth screams between the lines, of letters burned, portraits destroyed, and affections erased by scribes too scared to call a love story what it was. These women ruled, rebelled, and sometimes suffered, but somewhere behind the jeweled curtains and the courtiers' cold stares, they loved, and often they loved each other. History didn't want you to know that, but now you do. Hey guys, history loves to sell you the myth of lonely kings draped in velvet, surrounded by courtiers who smile too hard and wives they barely tolerate. But what if I told you some of those kings weren't so lonely after all? What if I told you that tucked behind those heavy velvet curtains, some rulers didn't just find companionship, but love, passion, and scandal with other men? This is the story of male lovers who ruled, whispered, plotted, and sometimes even shared the throne together. And trust me, the palace walls were never ready for what went on behind them. Richard Firmers of England and Philip II of France, the medieval royal couple that wasn't a secret. Let's rewind to the 12th century. Swords, chainmail, and shared beds. Richard the Lionheart, yes, the Crusader, the heartthrob of England, the manliest man in every poorly aged movie, had a connection with Philip II of France that made the Pope extremely uncomfortable. Chroniclers at the time whispered of their closeness with the kind of moral panic reserved for witchcraft and bad wine. The two monarchs not only formed military alliances and signed treaties, they also allegedly slept in the same bed and dined from the same plates. A monk named Roger of Hoveden wrote that Richard so loved Philip that they were inseparable. When Philip referred to Richard as my brother, it wasn't the medieval equivalent of bro. It was more like husband in tone, minus the church bells. Richard later married Berengaria of Navarre, but never fathered a child, and on his deathbed, his confession to sins of the flesh was unusually intense. The church may have forgiven him, but the history books never forgot, and neither did anyone paying attention to how often those two kings chose war, politics, and each other over the women who were legally required to be there. Hadrian and Antinous, Rome's grief-stricken emperor and his deified lover. Now we move to the Roman Empire, where queerness was practically carved into the marble. Enter Emperor Hadrian, philosopher, architect, beard trendsetter. He traveled the empire not with a wife or general, but with a breathtakingly beautiful young man named Antinous. Hadrian was obsessed. Antinous was more than a companion. He was the emotional axis around which the emperor's world spun. They toured the empire together, posed for statues, and whispered beneath the stars over the Nile. But it all ended in tragedy. Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile River in 130 CE. No one knows exactly how or why. What we do know is that Hadrian lost his mind with grief. He founded cities in Antinous' name, minted coins with his face, and had him declared a god, literally. Antinous became the last officially deified figure in Roman paganism. That's not the behavior of a casual fling. That's the behavior of a man who had a throne and lost the one person who made it bearable. James I of England and George Villiers. More than dear friend, fast forward to 17th century England. James I, the first Stuart king of both Scotland and England, left behind a flurry of love letters that make modern texts look emotionally repressed. While married to Anne of Denmark and fathering several children, James kept a series of favorites, most famously George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. James called George, my sweet child and wife, and his letters include such gems as, I desire only to live in this world for your sake. There's also a line about George resting between my legs, which wouldn't have been that odd if it weren't for the very long and very loving passages surrounding it. Parliament was scandalized. Political cartoons mocked their closeness. Foreign ambassadors gossiped endlessly about the king's infatuation. But James didn't care. He promoted George, gave him castles, titles, and authority. At one point, George was basically running the kingdom, while holding the king's heart in his velvet-gloved hand. Whether or not they ruled as equals, they certainly shared something that made the entire court clutch their pearls and reach for their smelling salts. Edward II of England and Piers Gaveston, obsession, jealousy, and one terrible end. Edward II wasn't a fan of convention. While kings were expected to marry noble women and produce heirs, Edward spent most of his reign doting on one man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wasn't just a favorite, he was the favorite. Edward knighted him, titled him, gave him lands, and even assigned him a place of honor at his wedding. Yes, to his own wedding. Awkward. Queen Isabella, remember her from the she-wolf days, hated Gaveston. So did the nobles, who accused Edward of spending royal funds and royal affections on his companion. At one point, Edward referred to Piers as my brother, my equal, a shocking phrase from a monarch who used to being above everyone else. Eventually, things came to a bloody end. Gaveston was captured by rebellious barons, mocked, and executed. Edward was devastated and never really recovered. The rest of his reign spiraled into war, civil unrest, and eventually his own deposition. But let it be known, for a few glittering years, the throne of England had two hearts beating behind it, and one of them was deeply, recklessly in love. Alexander the Great and Hephaestion, more than brothers in arms. Alexander the Great conquered half the known world before turning 30, but his heart had only one home, Hephaestion. The two were raised together, trained as warriors, and remained side by side through every campaign, skirmish, and siege. When Hephaestion died suddenly in 324 BCE, Alexander reacted with such overwhelming grief that historians still talk about it in hushed tones. He refused to eat. He refused to speak. He ordered a massive funeral, built temples in his memory, and demanded that Hephaestion be worshipped as a god. He even asked an oracle whether Hephaestion could be granted divine status. The answer? Build him a hero's shrine. So he did. Alexander married multiple women, but never loved any of them like he loved Hephaestion. In fact, his final instructions before dying were about burying them near each other. The conqueror of worlds was ultimately conquered by love, and it wasn't the kind historians were eager to admit. That's part 1, and we're just getting started. In part 2, we'll step inside Byzantine palaces, Renaissance beds, and Mughal courts, where power and passion danced dangerously close. The kings who ruled weren't always straight, and they weren't always subtle. Roger II of Sicily in the Palace of Secret Splendors. Welcome to 12th century Sicily, where cultures collided, languages overlapped, and power wore silk robes. Roger II was a Norman king ruling a Mediterranean melting pot, and his court was dripping in art, science, and intrigue. Historians love to praise his tolerance, but they whisper far more cautiously about the unusually intimate relationships he had with several young male courtiers. Roger's court chroniclers described his favorites as boyish beauties who shared his private chambers, his feasts, and, quite possibly, his silken bed. His most beloved, known only in a few preserved texts as Basil, was elevated from a Greek-speaking servant to one of the king's closest advisors. Basil never married. Neither did Roger remarry after his first queen died young. Instead, Roger poured his affections into expanding his private gardens and inviting his favorites on long retreats. There are no scandalous letters, no open proclamations, but the consistency of Basil's proximity, the sudden elevation of other young men, and the fury of conservative bishops all point to something very obvious, just shy of written confession. Roger ruled wisely and well. He also ruled quietly with the company of those whose presence to him was far more comforting than a cold political alliance. King Władysław IV and his court composer, 17th century Poland, a land of Baroque churches, saber-wielding nobles, and a king whose heart marched to the sound of a particular court composer's melody. Władysław IV Wasa, known for his love of music and theater, kept a very small, very exclusive inner circle. At the top of that list was Marco Scacchi, an Italian musician brought to court to compose royal fanfares, and ended up composing what might as well have been love songs directly to the king's soul. Władysław funded an entire opera house for Scacchi. He named him Master of the Royal Music, a title invented just for him. During a time when kings were supposed to be slaying dragons, or at least Cossacks, Władysław was hosting chamber concerts in candlelit halls, staring dreamily at his muse. Letters between them hint at shared travels, long conversations, and a near spiritual admiration that bordered on obsession. Court gossip? Endless. But Władysław never denied the depth of his connection, and even when his advisors pressed for him to focus on producing an heir, he found excuses to linger near his beloved musician. It wasn't war or plague that distracted this king. It was melody, harmony, and maybe, just maybe, a stolen kiss behind a velvet curtain. Emperor Ai of Han China and Dong Xian, the man who got the pillow. Time to jump to ancient China, 1st century BC, where love dared to share a pillow. Literally. Emperor Ai was young, idealistic, and completely captivated by a low-ranking official named Dong Xian. Within 2 years, Dong went from a nobody to the most powerful man in the Han court, showered with titles, palaces, and responsibilities far beyond his experience. According to official records, the emperor and Dong Xian shared a bed, and one night, the emperor didn't want to disturb Dong's sleep, so he cut off the sleeve of his robe rather than wake him. That moment became so iconic that the Chinese phrase, "the passion of the cut sleeve," is still used today as a euphemism for male-male love. Dong was granted unprecedented power. He issued decrees. He walked beside the emperor in public. He even received a military command despite having no experience. And no one dared protest, until, of course, the emperor died suddenly. What followed was swift and brutal. Dong was forced to commit suicide, his name stripped from the records, his honors revoked. But the story of the cut sleeve lived on even when emperors tried to bury the memory. For a brief, blazing moment, love ruled the Han dynasty, and then, as always, politics burned it down. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni and Malik Ayaz, the warrior and his beloved. Let's visit medieval Persia, where Mahmud of Ghazni, conqueror of over 30 Hindu kingdoms, was rumored to be completely and helplessly devoted to a young slave-turned-general named Malik Ayaz. Mahmud was no gentle poet. He was a ferocious warlord, credited with spreading Islam across the Indian subcontinent. But when it came to Ayaz, his iron facade crumbled into aching Persian verse. Yes, verse. Mahmud wrote poems, actual love poems, describing Ayaz's beauty, his voice, and his grace. In a world where masculinity was defined by conquest and cruelty, Mahmud's relationship with Ayaz was a curveball historians couldn't quite explain. Some tried to claim it was spiritual or symbolic. Others, less prudish, simply called it what it was, a love story forged in battle and court chambers alike. Ayaz was fiercely loyal, and Mahmud repaid him with land, power, and unshakable favoritism. When Mahmud died, Ayaz reportedly built a tomb in his memory and mourned him like a widower. This wasn't just a case of favoritism, it was a fierce devotion that lasted decades through war, politics, and cultural taboos. And unlike many stories on this list, theirs ended with quiet grief, not public execution. Prince Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King and his shadow lovers. Ludwig II, the mad genius behind Neuschwanstein Castle, had many obsessions: Wagnerian operas, moonlit lakes, and beautiful men with tragic eyes. Officially, he was a bachelor. Unofficially, his letters reveal a desperate, closeted longing that drove him to isolation, paranoia, and possibly death. Ludwig surrounded himself with handsome aides, stable boys, and guardsmen, many of whom became subjects of his tortured love letters. He was infatuated with Richard Wagner, though Wagner didn't return the favor, being too married to his own ego. Ludwig's real heartbreak came from forbidden affairs with younger men of lower status, affairs that were inevitably cut short by royal protocol and internalized shame. One such lover, Richard Hornig, was Ludwig's groom of the chamber. Their correspondence is heartbreaking, declarations of love followed by panic, fear, and sudden disappearances. Ludwig would exile them for their own safety, then write nightly about how he missed their presence in his dreams. Eventually declared insane by his family and dethroned, Ludwig died mysteriously, drowned in a lake alongside his psychiatrist. Whether it was suicide or something more sinister, his castles remain, haunting monuments to a king who loved fiercely but had nowhere to place that love safely. Charles XII of Sweden and the military boyfriend. Nobody talks about Charles XII, also called the Warrior King, spent most of his reign wearing armor and ignoring the existence of women. Entirely. He never married, never entertained courtships, and spent most of his time either on the battlefield or in the tent of Count Axel Lovwen, his closest confidant and lifelong companion. Contemporary accounts describe the two as inseparable. They shared tents in winter, rode together into war, and wrote to each other in code. It's unclear whether they were lovers or just very emotionally dependent war buddies, but given Charles's complete avoidance of traditional court life and Axel's enduring presence, suspicions were high and eyebrows even higher. When Charles died in battle, mysteriously shot in the head, some claimed Axel had been with him moments before. Conspiracy theories? Oh yes. Romantic tragedy? Almost certainly. Their letters, though sparse, drip with tenderness that seems wildly out of place for two men who literally spent their lives stabbing things with swords. And when Axel died, he was buried with a locket containing Charles's insignia. Not standard military protocol, unless your heart was permanently stationed under one king's command. And we're still not done. In part 3, we'll sail to the courts of Renaissance Italy, explore whispered romances in Indian palaces, and uncover the bedroom politics of revolutionary France. Some lovers ruled from the shadows, others tried to rule outright. Pope Julius III and the teenage lover who became a cardinal. Yes, you read that correctly. A pope, a teenage lover, and a cardinal hat that dropped like a wedding ring. Welcome to Renaissance Rome, where corruption was an art form and the line between spiritual devotion and carnal indulgence was as thin as a bishop's silk. Pope Julius III, who reigned from 1550 to 1555, shocked even the Vatican when he elevated a teenage beggar named Innocenzo Ciocci del Monte to the position of cardinal. Not bishop, not monk, cardinal. How did this uneducated street boy rise faster than a papal incense cloud? He was, according to contemporary sources, Julius's inseparable companion. Found loitering in the gardens by the Pope's brother, Innocenzo was brought to Julius as a servant. He never left. They ate together, slept in adjoining chambers, went on retreats, and Julius publicly referred to Innocenzo as "my adopted son," a popular euphemism of the time for "we don't want to talk about it." The backlash was apocalyptic. Cardinals rioted, nobles screamed, but Julius refused to budge. He gave Innocenzo palaces, incomes, titles, and, most scandalously, authority. The boy had power, not just affection, and after Julius died, Innocenzo was promptly banished, arrested for murder, and left to rot in exile. Still, for 5 wild years, the Vatican was ruled by a man in love. And his lover? a teenage beggar who accidentally became one of the most powerful men in Christendom. The Mughals and the soft power of male affection. India's Mughal emperors loved poetry, jewels, and forbidden pleasures. Among them, Babur, the first Mughal emperor and founder of a dynasty, stands out not just for his military conquests, but for the shocking honesty of his memoirs. In them, he confesses his love for a young boy named Baburi, writing with more tenderness than he ever did about his wife or children. Yes, Babur wrote an entire section of his autobiography, detailing how his heart would tremble in Baburi's presence, how he longed for his smile, and how his spirit broke when the boy was gone. This was no coded political alliance or veiled admiration. It was romantic poetry in the form of court chronicle, and the Mughal court didn't even blink. Love between men, while not publicly celebrated, was quietly acknowledged and woven into the tapestry of royal life. Babur wasn't the only emperor with such inclinations, but he was rare in his honesty. In an empire defined by grandeur, his most intimate luxury was confession. The affair didn't last, of course. Power called, empires rose, hearts withered. But those pages survived, etched in Persian ink, echoing through the centuries. Gian Gaston de' Medici, Florence's final, fabulous failure. By the time Gian Gaston de' Medici inherited the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, Florence was already falling apart. So he decided to go down with style, and an entourage of handsome young men known as the Ruspanti, who were paid to entertain, flatter, and yes, sleep with the aging duke. Gian Gaston was miserable. His arranged marriage was a sexual catastrophe. His sister hated him. The nobility mocked him, so he holed up in his palace, brought in a rotating cast of attractive men from the streets of Florence, and gave up entirely on public appearances. He abolished public executions, lightened taxes, and tried to implement reforms. But all anyone talked about was how he spent his nights laughing, drinking, and cuddling with his companions. He died childless, leaving behind a broken state and a legacy of whispered decadence. The Medici dynasty ended with him, and with it, one of the most fabulous royal disasters history has ever seen. Emperor Hadrian and the god-touched tragedy of Antinous Hadrian ruled Rome during its peak, traveled more than any other emperor, and built walls that still bear his name. But none of that pierced the heart of history, like his love for Antinous, a Greek youth whose beauty was said to rival the gods, and whose death sparked one of the strangest imperial cults the ancient world had ever seen. Hadrian met Antinous on a diplomatic visit and was instantly captivated. The boy became his constant companion, traveling across the empire at his side. They hunted together, worshipped together, and likely shared far more than just campfire stories. Then, in Egypt, Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile. Hadrian's grief was monumental. He declared the boy a god, built an entire city in his name, commissioned hundreds of statues, temples, coins, some say even made sacrifices to his memory. Rome didn't flinch. The Senate grumbled, of course, but no one dared challenge the emperor's sorrow. Antinous became the last god of the Roman pantheon, a divinely handsome boy beloved by an emperor who couldn't bear to forget. It wasn't politics. It wasn't duty. It was grief, the kind of grief that turns into legend. James I of England and his very questionable favorites. James I, the first Stuart King of England, brought with him not just a thick Scottish accent and a love of witch trials, but a string of extremely attractive male courtiers who just happened to be gifted titles, lands, and a little something called unearned influence. The most infamous was George Villiers, whom James called his sweet child and wife. The letters between them are not subtle. James wrote, "I desire only to live in your heart, die in your arms," and regularly referred to George's body as the temple of my joy. Eyebrows were raised and then quickly lowered because kings have swords. George rose from a country nobody to Duke of Buckingham, and with that rise came a flurry of enemies, rumors, and eventually assassination. James was inconsolable. He wrote poems. He locked himself away. He ordered mourning ceremonies that rivaled a queen's funeral. Did they consummate it? The records are careful. The gossip wasn't. James's legacy was shaped by religious conflict and political tension, but it was softened, strangely, by his devotion to the men who sat too close on royal thrones. And we're not done yet. In Part 4, will unravel forbidden liaisons in African kingdoms, the steamy secrets of revolutionary generals, and the ghost of a French emperor whose final letters suggest an unspoken love, King Mwanga II of Buganda and his page boys' rebellion. Let's travel to late 19th century Africa, specifically to the Kingdom of Buganda in modern-day Uganda. King Mwanga II wasn't just fighting against European colonialism, he was also battling the furious winds of religion, rebellion, and the consequences of his own preferences. Mwanga was a young king with a sharp mind, a violent temper, and a taste for his male pages. In his court, it was expected that royal attendants, especially the young attractive boys, would serve the king not only with obedience, but with intimacy. This was known, whispered, accepted in silence. That is, until Christianity marched in. Missionaries began converting Mwanga's attendants. Suddenly, young boys were saying no to a king. In 1886, a group of royal pages openly defied him, refusing his advances on religious grounds. Mwanga responded with a fury so volcanic it's still remembered today. He ordered the execution of 45 Christian converts, many of whom were his former lovers. Their death shocked the empire. Some became martyrs, others symbols of defiance. Mwanga lost his grip on the throne several times, eventually dying in exile. His legacy? A dangerous blend of colonization, rebellion, and a tragic, fatal expression of desire in a changing world. Frederick the Great of Prussia and the lover. His father hated Frederick the Great, military genius, philosopher, king, composer, and hopeless romantic. Behind the steel armor of Prussia's greatest ruler was a boy who just wanted to read poetry, play flute, and be left alone with his best friend, Hans Hermann von Katte. But Frederick's father, Frederick William I, wasn't having it. The elder king was obsessed with discipline and masculinity, and he saw his son's soft demeanor and intense affection for Katte as dangerous, treasonous even. Frederick and Katte tried to escape Prussia together. They were caught, and the punishment? Unspeakable. Frederick was thrown in prison, and then forced to watch Katte be executed in front of him. The young prince reportedly fainted as his lover's head hit the ground. It broke him, but it also hardened him. Years later, as king, Frederick married, for appearances, but lived alone at Sanssouci Palace, surrounding himself with art, dogs, and male companions. His writings overflowed with melancholy and longing, and when he died, he asked to be buried without pomp, next to his dogs, not his wife. The man who built an empire died, remembering the boy who died for love. Chevalier d'Eon and the spectrum of royal queerness. Let's twist the crown one more time. Charles Geneviève Louis Auguste André Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont, yes, that's one name, was a French diplomat, soldier, spy, and gender-fluid legend who lived openly as both man and woman in the 18th century. Assigned male at birth, d'Eon served King Louis XV in various roles: duelist, emissary, secret agent. Then one day, they simply started wearing dresses and never looked back. Was it political theater? A personal truth? Both? d'Eon claimed to have been assigned female at birth, but raised as a boy for inheritance reasons. Historians debate this, but what isn't debated is that d'Eon spent the second half of their life as La Chevalière, wearing silks, attending salons, and fencing men with brutal elegance. When the revolution came, d'Eon lost their royal pension and was forced to perform fencing duels for money in London. After death, a medical exam revealed a perfectly formed male body, but with remarkably feminine features. d'Eon defied every royal norm, and in doing so became the living embodiment of queerness before the word even existed. Tahiri, Persia's revolutionary poetess in Love and Veil. Now we bend the category slightly. Not a queen, not a king, but a mystic warrior of the pen. Tahiri, the 19th century Persian poet and theologian who fought for gender equality, and, according to some accounts, shared deep, possibly romantic bonds with other women in her circle. Tahiri's writings were mystical, revolutionary, and unmistakably intimate. In a society where women were shrouded and silent, she ripped off her veil in public and declared, "You can kill me, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." She was arrested, imprisoned, and finally strangled with her own scarf. Her last words? "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you will not stop the emancipation of women." While many of her relationships are lost to time, Some letters, smuggled through hidden channels, speak of love, longing, and desire directed toward other women. Tahiri lived in rebellion against every imposed identity. Her life by default was queer. She wasn't just ahead of her time, she was a time bomb. The final crown, when queerness and power collide. So what do we make of all this? From imperial China to Victorian England, from Roman emperors to African monarchs, the thrones of history were not as straight-laced as they'd like you to believe. Behind every gold-encrusted portrait hangs 1,000 whispered scandals, stolen glances, and midnight confessions. Kings ruled with lovers at their side. Queens pined in letters never meant for history's stage. And sometimes, just sometimes, they dared to live in truth, even if it meant exile, execution, or eternal erasure. Their love shaped wars, their desires rewrote laws, and their stories survived not because they were permitted, but because they refused to vanish. So when someone tells you history is just facts, remind them, facts are what's left behind. But truth? Truth is who dared to live, love, and burn beneath the crown. And that, dear viewer, is the legacy of the men who loved men and ruled anyway. Until next time, keep your curiosity sharp and your judgment soft. History isn't always kind, but it is always honest if you know where to look. Hey guys, imagine being the most powerful woman in Europe, and still risking everything for the quiet smile of the girl brushing your hair. Imagine velvet gowns, poisoned letters, and royal secrets whispered between lace curtains. What happens when a queen's heart falls out of line and into the arms of her lady-in-waiting? Stick around because this is not your grandmother's fairy tale. Let us begin where drama blossoms best, in the doomed palaces of 18th century Europe, that glorious madhouse of powdered wigs, collapsing empires, and dysfunctional families in gold-encrusted furniture. And no one epitomized that unholy trifecta quite like Queen Christina of Sweden. Christina didn't want to be queen. She wanted to fence, ride horses, read Descartes, and occasionally insult ambassadors in 6 languages. Born in 1626, she was immediately raised as the heir to the Swedish throne, because her father Gustavus Adolphus had no sons and a spectacular disregard for gender norms. He once declared Christina had the heart of a man, which, in his world, was supposed to be a compliment. By the time she was 6, courtiers were already whispering that she walked too stiffly, read too much, and had no interest in embroidery. She allegedly refused to bathe regularly, considered marriage a barbarous institution, and kept her bedroom decorated in weapons and classical philosophy. In other words, she was one high-heeled boot away from becoming Europe's first Goth philosopher monarch. But the true scandal began when she turned her gaze on a certain Countess Ebba Sparre, a striking young lady-in-waiting with a face made for oil portraits and a name that sounded like it belonged on a romantic novel cover. Christina didn't just love Ebba, she obsessed over her. The queen gave her the pet name Belle, showered her with gifts, letters, and public declarations of adoration that made the Swedish court clutch its collective pearls so hard they almost passed out. Historians argue whether their relationship was romantic, erotic, platonic, or all of the above. But the letters speak volumes. In one, Christina writes, "I embraced you 1,000 times. I kiss your beautiful hands." Not exactly casual queen-to-maid talk. But here's the twist. Christina was supposed to marry. And she refused, over and over. Diplomats sent marriage proposals by the dozen, and she rejected every single one like they were bad Tinder dates. She even told the Pope she had no inclination to wed a man, and then moved to Rome after abdicating her throne. Yes, she gave up an entire kingdom, allegedly for her beliefs, her freedom, her mind. But quietly, people wondered if Belle had anything to do with it. Ebba, under pressure from her own noble family, was eventually forced to marry someone else. Christina was heartbroken. She called Belle's marriage a betrayal, but the letters kept coming. Even years after abdicating, Christina wrote to Ebba with aching affection, saying her love would never die. Meanwhile, Rome didn't know what to do with the ex-queen turned Catholic convert, with suspiciously intimate relationships and a disdain for papal ceremony. She shocked the Vatican by wearing men's clothing, debating bishops, and keeping a suspiciously large number of handsome young secretaries. When asked why she dressed like a man, Christina replied, "I do it because it's easier to ride a horse and command a room. Fair." By the time she died, Christina had left a trail of love letters, broken traditions, and historical migraines for every biographer who tried to fit her into a neat box. She was Sweden's queen, Rome's headache, and Belle Spare's lifelong shadow. Now, let's jump sideways across the continent to another queen and another mess. France, the 1770s. The French court was many things: decadent, corrupt, allergic to common sense, but above all it was bored, and nothing cured royal boredom quite like gossip, especially if it involved Queen Marie Antoinette. Ah yes, the queen who would one day allegedly tell peasants to eat cake if they had no bread. She didn't actually say that, but historical libel is just part of the costume. Marie was 15 when she was married off to the awkward, sex-shy Louis XVI, a man more interested in locks and keys than his wife's heart. Into this emotional void stepped the Duchess of Polignac. Yolande de Polastron, Duchess of Polignac, was everything Marie's husband wasn't: glamorous, charismatic, fashionable, flirtatious. They met at Versailles, and the connection was instant. Within weeks, the queen was giving her titles, wealth, and the kind of access that made other nobles fume. Yolande was appointed governess of the royal children, despite having no qualifications, simply because Marie wanted her close. Their letters are lost to history, suspiciously burned during the Revolution. But what remains is the intensity of their public displays of affection. Eyewitnesses describe Marie leaning on Yolande's shoulder, whispering in her ear during dinners, disappearing into private chambers for hours. Some even claim they shared a bedroom at Petit Trianon, the queen's private retreat. Now, to be clear, aristocratic women of that era were allowed to be physically affectionate. It was part of the theater of femininity, but what Marie and Yolande shared went beyond hand-holding. It was power, obsession, and possibly a royal romance hidden in plain sight. The court hated it. Pamphlets circulated with pornographic illustrations of the queen in bed with her ladies. Sapphic orgies were the hot fake news of the day. These weren't just attempts to discredit Marie, they were political weapons. If the queen could be accused of deviant sexuality, then surely the monarchy itself was corrupt. Yolande became a lightning rod for revolutionary hatred. The rumors followed her even into exile. Did they love each other? We may never know for certain, but the intimacy, the jealousy, the favors, the destruction, all point to a bond deeper than friendship. A bond that may have been the queen's only real passion in a life otherwise dictated by statecraft and public scrutiny. And while France was sharpening its guillotine, let's take one quick detour to another royal disaster: Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to her friends as Sisi. Sisi was the 19th century equivalent of a royal Instagram model. Impossibly beautiful, deeply depressed, and always running from her responsibilities. She hated court life, despised her mother-in-law, and often vanished for months at a time, riding horses through forests or sailing around the Mediterranean on yachts she claimed were for her nerves. But in the middle of all this self-imposed exile, Sisi had a constant companion, Countess Irma Staray, her lady-in-waiting. Irma followed Sisi everywhere, literally, across countries, through crises, into seclusion. She dressed her, combed her hair, soothed her anxieties, and wrote long, admiring descriptions of the Empress's divine form. She even held Sisi in her arms as she died, stabbed by an anarchist in Geneva. Some historians chalk it up to loyalty. Others raise an eyebrow. Irma never married. After Sisi's death, she wore mourning for the rest of her life, and in her memoirs she wrote not of royalty or politics, but of Sisi's skin, her smile, her loneliness. You don't have to call it love, but it sure feels like it, and that's just part one. Next, we head into Tudor England, Imperial Russia, and the secret letters that never made it into the history books, but left scorch marks all the same. Buckle up. The velvet curtain hasn't even lifted yet. Let's pick up where we left off, right in the velvet-draped war zone of royal bedrooms and whispered scandals. Because if you thought forbidden love was hard and powdered wigs, wait until you see what the Tudors had to say about it. Let's start with England's baddest monarch in a corset, Queen Anne Boleyn. You may know her as the second wife of Henry VIII, the one who lost her head, literally, because she couldn't produce a male heir. But beneath the political scheming and the Renaissance soap opera, there's a subplot the textbooks often forget to mention. Enter Anne Savage, Anne Savage wasn't just a lady-in-waiting. She was one of Anne Boleyn's closest confidants, present during private meetings, secret planning sessions, and even the hidden wedding ceremony when Anne married Henry in secret. Letters suggest a closeness that stretched beyond protocol. They traveled together, shared chambers, and were reportedly devoted to each other in ways that made some courtiers uncomfortable. Now, is there concrete evidence that Anne Boleyn and Anne Savage were more than just friends? But consider this. Anne Savage refused to speak ill of Boleyn even after her execution. She turned down titles, marriages, and wealth, and quietly faded from court life rather than betray the queen who once called her the other half of her soul. Maybe it was loyalty, maybe it was grief, or maybe it was the kind of heartbreak that can't be written in official chronicles. But for the really spicy stuff, we now fly east, Russia, the 18th century, where court intrigue wasn't a hobby, it was a blood sport, and no one played it better than Empress Catherine the Great. Now, Catherine is best known for her, how should we put it, active romantic resume. And yes, she had male lovers aplenty, but less well known are her relationships with the women of her court, chief among them, Princess Praskovia Bruce. Praskovia was Catherine's lady-in-waiting, personal confidant, and allegedly her bedroom body double. Yes, that's a real historical rumor. Some gossipy records even suggest Catherine used Bruce to test new lovers. Whether that's true or just 18th century fanfiction is up for debate, but their emotional closeness is well documented. They wrote letters, exchanged gifts, and were inseparable for years, until Praskovia was caught in a scandal involving a particularly handsome officer and Catherine's intense jealousy. The Empress banished her immediately, not her male lover, her. Why? Because betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the one you actually loved. And speaking of betrayals, let's get very French again. The French Revolution didn't just decapitate kings and queens, it also chopped the heads off old friendships, alliances, and any whisper of romantic rebellion. Meet Madame de Genlis, a brilliant writer, educator, and possibly the great love of Queen Marie Antoinette's rival, the Duchess of Orléans. Madame de Genlis was everything the Revolution feared, intellectual, independent, and dangerously persuasive. She served as a tutor to royal children, including the future King Louis-Philippe. But behind the velvet curtain, she had a bond with the Duchess that was so emotionally intense, even revolutionary spies took notice. Letters from Genlis are full of longing, poetic obsession, and that very specific brand of 18th century melodrama that says, I may be teaching your children, but I'd rather be holding your hand by candlelight. Now let's move to a different kind of empire, one built on sunburn and rigid uniforms, the British Raj. And here, we find a love story so overlooked, even most historians didn't bother to raise an eyebrow. Meet Queen Victoria and her Indian attendant, Abdul Karim. Now, before you grab the pitchfork, yes, Abdul was a man, but stay with me. Abdul's story highlights a key pattern. When queens were suffocating under courtly rituals and national expectations, they often turned to their attendants for real emotional connection, and sometimes those connections defied every social rule and gender expectation of the time. Victoria called Abdul her munshi, her teacher, and trusted him more than her own children. She broke protocol to dine with him, gave him land and titles, and enraged her entire household by keeping him at her side through scandal after scandal. While their relationship wasn't romantic, it mirrored the same dynamic we've seen. Royal isolation, emotional desperation, and one forbidden bond that shattered the expectations of a nation. And yet again, we circle back to letters. So many letters. Love letters, burned letters, lost letters. Because what better way to hide history than by simply setting it on fire? Take Queen Christina of Sweden again. Yes, we already talked about her. But let's zoom in on one final tragic chapter. After abdicating, Christina continued corresponding with women across Europe. Artists, poets, royal widows, each letter dripping with affection and unspoken longing. In one such letter she writes, "They call me unnatural. I call them blind. What I feel is truth, what they fear is my freedom." It's poetic, sure, but it's also a declaration, a queen's manifesto. She wasn't just escaping a crown, she was escaping a prison made of gender roles, tradition, and what society told her she should desire. And that's the thing, isn't it? These weren't just sapphic whispers behind silk fans. These were acts of rebellion. Women carving out slivers of autonomy inside systems designed to control every breath they took. Queens weren't free. Not really. Their bodies belonged to dynasties, their hearts to politics, their futures to marriage contracts. So when a queen dared to love her lady-in-waiting, when she clutched a hand in the shadows, or shared a bed behind tapestries, or wrote a line of poetry only one person was ever meant to read, it wasn't just romance. It was revolution. In Part 3, we'll dig into the secret language of sapphic love in royal courts, decode lost diaries, and explore how homophobia shaped the official records we trust far too easily. Because where history erases, we dig deeper. Let's now pull back the brocade curtains of history and peer directly into the boudoirs, drawing rooms and coded diaries of women who loved women, yet had to survive a world that would rather believe they were merely passionate friends. Welcome to the third act, where the repression is suffocating, but the love is still luminous. Let's begin in Renaissance Italy, where sapphic drama flourished like forbidden roses behind cloistered convent walls. Enter Queen Bona Sforza of Poland, born into the powerful Milanese Sforza family. Known for her ambition, intelligence, and utterly ruthless political maneuvering, Bona wasn't exactly a romantic, unless you read between the lines of her personal correspondences with her closest female companion, Caterina Tassi. Tassi was officially just another courtier. Unofficially, she was the woman Bona wrote to obsessively, traveled with in secret, and installed in her private chambers, despite heavy objections from clergy and nobles alike. When Caterina died unexpectedly, Bona shut down her court for 3 days. Not even her husband's death received that level of mourning. Coincidence? Or just another tragic love story hidden under centuries of euphemism? Meanwhile, in 17th century Prussia, Queen Sophie Charlotte, philosopher, musician, and patron of Leibniz, was known for rejecting nearly every aspect of conventional queenhood. She loathed Berlin, hated the rigid Prussian court, and escaped often to her rural estate, always accompanied by her confidant and suspected lover, Countess Katharina von Wartenberg. The two women shared years of letters so emotionally charged that one historian described them as too affectionate to be purely platonic, yet too strategic to be openly romantic. Sophie Charlotte's insistence on surrounding herself with women she chose, not noble women assigned by the king, sparked numerous accusations and rumors, which she never addressed. And that silence? It was its own kind of protest, because silence, historically, has been the armor of sapphic queens. Consider the elaborate coded language that developed among women in early modern Europe, a web of metaphor, shared poetry, and symbolic gifts. A sprig of rosemary meant loyalty, a violet pressed between pages, I dare to love you, and a handkerchief dropped not by accident, but as a signal, meet me where no one can follow. Now, let's travel south to Spain and step into the royal chambers of Queen Mariana Victoria of Spain, betrothed to Louis XV of France at the age of 3, yes, 3, and rejected by the French court before she hit puberty. Unsurprisingly, Mariana grew up with a deep distrust of dynastic marriage. Her emotional world was built not around kings or princes, but women. One such woman was Duchess Luisa de Osorio, her lady-in-waiting and lifelong companion. Court records referred to Luisa as the Queen's second shadow. The two women were inseparable, sleeping, dining, and traveling together. In her personal diary, Mariana described Luisa as the keeper of her soul and my heart in another body, and still official history called it devotion, as if love, real love, was too unthinkable to be named. But the prize for most unapologetically queer royal love letters? That belongs to Anne Lister of Shibden Hall. While not a queen in title, Anne ruled her Yorkshire estate like a monarch and seduced noble women across Europe like a sovereign of desire. Her encoded diaries, written in a combination of Greek and her own invented cipher, detail relationships with dozens of women, including aristocrats, heiresses, and even one married duchess. Anne's love letters didn't whisper, they roared. To Anne Walker, the woman she would eventually call her wife, Anne wrote, I am yours more than I have words to say. If the world burns, let it burn, so long as I can sleep beside you tonight. It's telling that Anne Lister was ridiculed in her lifetime, then buried by history until her diaries were decoded in the 1980s. That's how hard the past tried to erase her. That's how threatening a woman loving another woman really was. But even in ancient civilizations, before monotheism and Victorian morality locked everything down, sapphic relationships weren't always hidden. In Egypt, pharaohs may have ruled the sands, but powerful queens and priestesses wielded subtler, softer power. One such pair, Queen Hatshepsut and her chief advisor and high priestess, Neferur. Historians still debate whether Neferur was Hatshepsut's daughter, adopted heir, or romantic partner. What's certain is that after Hatshepsut's rise to pharaoh status, yes, she ruled as king, Neferur's titles and depictions in royal art became astonishingly elevated, far beyond what a mere servant would receive. Some stele even show them hand in hand, gazing at each other in poses normally reserved for married pairs. Coincidence? Maybe. But considering how quickly Neferur disappears from the records after Hatshepsut's death, we're left with the ancient world's favorite tactic: erase the love, rewrite the legacy. And we can't leave out Japan's Heian period, where court life was dominated by poetry, silks, and layered desires. Female courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and even empresses wrote love poems to one another, many preserved in anthologies that somehow dodged the scissors of censors. One poem, written from a lady-in-waiting to her queen, reads, "I untie your sash in the moonlight, but fear the sun will shame us in the morning. Yet still I come every night again." That is not platonic. That is not friendship. That is sapphic longing wrapped in silk and moonlight. All this points to one undeniable truth. History didn't lack lesbian queens and royal women who loved other women. It lacked permission to say so. Whether it was Anne Savage dying in quiet loyalty, Catherine the Great's banished favorites, or poets smuggling metaphors across centuries, these women were more than footnotes. They were rebels, survivors, lovers in the wrong time, but with the right hearts. And in part 4, we're not just going to wrap things up, we're going to burn the palace down. We'll confront the aftermath, how these women's stories were buried, rewritten, or twisted into cautionary tales, and how modern historians are finally resurrecting what centuries tried to hide. Because queer love didn't start with us, but it might finally get the ending it deserves. Welcome back to the final chapter of our royal roller coaster through forbidden sapphic love. In the last parts, we peeled back the velvet drapes of palaces and convents, revealed secret glances, coded poems, and morning rituals far too intense for just friends. But now, we step into the aftermath, the part where queens die, empires move on in history. That stubborn gatekeeper slams the door shut on stories that didn't fit the official narrative. Until now. So let's talk about the erasure. It wasn't enough to let these women die. History had to neuter their legacies. Royal biographers scrubbed diaries, edited letters, and invented suitable male love interests where there were none. They called romantic letters between queens and their ladies literary flourishes. They insisted that shared bedrooms were logistical, not emotional. And in cases where they couldn't cover it up, they simply declared it was a phase. Queen Christina of Sweden, for instance, is still being debated in history departments around the world. This was a woman who wore men's clothes, rejected marriage, abdicated her throne, and surrounded herself with brilliant women. One in particular, Countess Ebba Sparre. She called her bedfellow, her beloved, and the person I would rather have than a kingdom. Christina's contemporaries rolled their eyes and muttered scandal. But modern historians keep asking, but what is? It really romantic? Why are we so terrified to admit that a queen might have loved another woman? Is it because power and queerness are still seen as incompatible? Or because admitting it would mean rewriting more than just the history books? It would mean rewriting identity? Take the case of Queen Anne of Great Britain and Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Their letters practically steam with jealousy, desperation, and clinging devotion. Sarah's replacement, Abigail Masham, was seen as a political usurper, but it's clear there was more than politics at stake. Sarah referred to Anne's affections for Abigail as unnatural fondness and accused her of being bewitched. When Anne died, her letters to Sarah were destroyed. Sarah kept hers. She published them, not because she wanted to out Anne, but because she wanted people to know she had been loved. It was vindication, not scandal. Now let's examine why we've only recently begun unearthing these stories. The answer lies in archives, dusty, disorganized, and often guarded by centuries of shame. Historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries had no incentive to spotlight queer relationships. In fact, most refused to acknowledge them even when the evidence slapped them across the monocle. But in the 21st century, the shift began. Suddenly, Anne Lister's diaries were being decoded. Queen Christina's wardrobe was re-evaluated not as eccentric, but as gender nonconforming. Paintings once labeled allegorical were reconsidered as actual romantic depictions. The language of friendship and loyalty was interrogated. The euphemisms, passionate companionship, dear intimacy, devoted friendship, were seen for what they were, veils to mask desire. There's something revolutionary about finally calling these queens what they were, not just rulers, not just wives and mothers, but women who loved other women, sometimes desperately, sometimes joyously, always with stakes that felt life or death, because for them, it was. Let's remember how dangerous it was to even hint at queerness. To say, I want her, in a world built entirely around male heirs, political marriages, and bloodline preservation was treason adjacent. It risked not just reputation, but sometimes the throne, and even life. And yet they did it anyway. They kissed in shadows, carved initials into walls, gave each other rings, locked eyes across ballrooms, wrote poetry under candlelight. They endured ridicule, surveillance, exile. They weren't just romantic. They were brave in a way that modern love rarely requires. They didn't get pride parades. They got whispered rumors, burned letters, and historical gaslighting. But their stories are still here. Because no matter how many male advisors tried to drown them in decency, no matter how many historians labeled them eccentric or repressed or hysterical, love leaves a mark. You can scrub the ink, but not the intention. And so we come to the real question, why tell these stories now? Because history isn't just names and dates, it's survival. It's the trail of breadcrumbs left by people who weren't allowed to say who they were. And every time we find one of those breadcrumbs, a poem, a letter, a love song, a scribbled name in a diary, we get to rebuild the feast that should have been remembered all along. Because the world told these queens, you may rule, but not like that. And they said, watch me. This video isn't just about forbidden love, it's about defiance, about legacy, about refusing to disappear just because your love doesn't make heirs or please the church. It's about women who saw through the masquerade and chose each other anyway, even if history tried to erase them for it. So to all the forgotten queens and their companions, their favorites, their inseparable shadows, we see you now, we remember. And to anyone watching this who's ever felt like their love wasn't historical enough to matter, surprise, it already did. Thanks for staying until the end. If you're still here, you're part of the resistance. Be proud of that. And stay curious, stay irreverent, and stay in love, even if it's the kind history once tried to hide, because the palace walls remember more than they admit.